Hi students, welcome to Science Extension and Module 1, the Foundations of Scientific Thinking. This is video number 3 and we're going to be looking at induction and deduction. Our learning intention for this video is for you to be able to compare induction and deduction with reference to scientific inquiry. To do this, we're going to split this video up into three kind of sections. A section where we look at induction and how inductive reasoning is used in science and potentially some of its limitations. Deduction and how deductive reasoning is used in science and again, perhaps some of its limitations. And then general reasoning in modern science and why these two methods of reasoning are both very, very important in modern science. In recently looking at some of the great presentations that were part of the New Scientist extravaganza in London, obviously I wasn't in London, which I was, but I was watching some of those from here online. And one of the things that I picked up that I haven't done enough of, I think, in a lot of my videos is to share some of the sources that I'm using when I create these videos. One of the things that we talk about in science is reproducibility and being able to carry out the same sort of activities that other scientists have carried out in order to duplicate their results, or at least to test those results in any case. So here are some of the key sources that I've used in the preparation of this video and also of the accompanying notes that you guys will get in class. What is this thing called Science is a fantastic book. It's almost a textbook for this first section of work. Has a lot of great ideas and summarizes the key points that we're looking at as we go through these different historical looks at the development of philosophy and science. A nice, short, concise introduction is provided by a little introduction, Philosophy of Science, produced by Oxford, and I've drawn from that. I've also drawn from updated versions of Isaac Newton's Principia. I don't have an original copy. I wish I did, but probably wouldn't understand half the language. But it's absolutely a phenomenal piece of work and has been continually updated. There's a few quotes you'll find from that. Some nice diagrams from Understanding Science and also a little article that I will reference as we go through. But let's get into it. So one of the things that we want to do is talk about reasoning in science. We've come from an understanding of empiricism and the importance of observations and experimentation in development of scientific knowledge. Now we want to split this up into two key areas, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. And in order to look at the definitions of those and how they can be applied in modern science. If observation of the world is carried out in a careful, unprejudiced way, then the facts established in this way will constitute a secure, objective basis for science. If further, the reasoning that takes us from this factual basis to the laws and theories that constitute scientific knowledge is sound, then the resulting knowledge can itself be taken to be securely established and objective. This comes in the opening page of Chalmers' What is this thing called science? And it sets the stage for this view of what scientific knowledge is, how it differs from other forms of knowledge, and how important it is to link that knowledge to observation and experimentation. In fact, one of the things that distinguishes science from other pursuits is its relationship between observation and logical conclusions. We also call this reasoning. So in this particular video, we're going to look at two distinct schools of reasoning, inductive and deductive, and determine their importance in the pursuit of scientific reasoning. Chalmers identified two common views of science which link observations and theories, empiricism and positivism. Both views emphasize the importance of linking observations with inferences, but as our experience with optical illusions tells us, sometimes seeing is not believing. Chalmers has a word of warning for us at the beginning of this work. Before an observer can formulate and assent to an observation statement, he or she must be in possession of the appropriate conceptual framework and a knowledge of how to appropriately apply it. This conceptual framework is critical to our understanding and our application of science, and it's going to be something that we're going to continue to explore over the next few videos. So what is induction? Well, according to inductive reasoning, induction is a set of individual propositions used to derive a general conclusion. Importantly, and something to keep in mind when we talk about deduction later, the conclusion goes beyond the information of each of the underlying propositions. This is the process known as generalization. Through induction, general laws or principles or theories are derived from observations of particular instances. So we go from the specific to the general. A simple, probably an oversimplified example, but one that will serve our purposes here is the observation, all swans that I've observed are white. This is a single or a series of specific observations. And from that, an inference, therefore, all swans are white. So all swans is now a generalization that every single particular bird of this particular type are all white. This is how inductive reasoning works. We start with an observation or a series of observations of specific events, and then we generalize to a wider group. If we move away from swans and we have a look at the cell theory, we can see the inductive reasoning that's been applied to the cell theory. Theories developed through inductive reasoning are broad explanations for a number of related phenomena, and they're held true until proven otherwise. If we were applying inductive reasoning to the cell theory, what we would observe is different types or examples of living materials under a microscope. So, for example, we might examine a number of leaves under a microscope. We notice that the leaves contain cells. This leads to the idea that all living things are built from cells. Specific observations of leaves, general observations of living things in general. And so therefore, we'd expect to see cells when we look at living things up close. This is the application of the general law. The laws and theories that make up scientific knowledge are derived by induction from a factual basis supplied by observation and experiment. Another nice little definition from Chalmers. Newton's Principia is a set of inductive arguments which establish that impenetrability, mobility, and impetus of bodies and the laws of motion and the laws of gravity are features of every system in the universe. Newton couldn't possibly observe every celestial body and everything in motion. So therefore, what we must conclude is that Newton's laws were based on inductive reasoning. In fact, we can look at 4 rules of induction that were used by Isaac Newton. In the first rule, we are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearance. In Rule 2, therefore, the same natural effects we must, as far as possible, assign the same causes. The relationship between cause and effect is something we're going to look at a lot in this particular course, and certainly a little more as we delve further into it. But the relationship that we have in science between cause and effect are very important, and they often inform our hypotheses and inform the experimental designs that we come up with in order to test those hypotheses. Rule 3 is getting to the real nitty-gritty of induction. Rule 3 for Newton is the quality of bodies which admit neither intensification nor remission of degrees and which are found to belong to all bodies within the reach of our experiments are esteemed the universal qualities of all bodies whatsoever. Once we start talking about universal qualities, we're going beyond what we've looked at in the laboratory and we're applying it to all things everywhere. This is a generalization, and hence this is the root of induction. Newton's Rule 4 in experimental philosophy were to look upon propositions inferred by general induction from phenomena as accurately or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypothesis that may be imagined till such time as other phenomena occur by which they may either be more accurate or liable to exceptions. This is a really great summary of how science has moved forward. Perhaps it's even a premonition that Newton had that his laws were not going to apply universally everywhere. And now we know from Einstein's relativity that they don't. Certainly bodies that are moving at speeds approaching the speed of light don't obey Newton's rules or laws or mathematical relationships as he developed them. And this is a very important component of science, to be able to continue to do experiments, to gather more data and evidence, to analyze that data in the light of the overall picture of what science says is going on, and perhaps to challenge that understanding is the way that science moves on. And sometimes we have exceptions to rules, and those of you who do chemistry know about the exceptions to the rules. But there are also times where we've had to kind of throw an idea out altogether and start again. Newton's 4 propositions became fundamental laws in physics. Regarding inductive reasoning and his discoveries, Newton wrote the following in his Principia. In this philosophy, particular propositions are inferred from the phenomena, and afterwards rendered general by induction. Thus it was that the impenetrability, the mobility, and the impulsive force of bodies and the laws of motion and of gravity were discovered. And to us, it's enough that gravity really does exist and act according to the laws which we've explained, and abundantly serves to account for all the motions of the celestial bodies and of our sea. Newton was very comprehensive in his application of his understanding of the laws of motion to all bodies everywhere in the universe. But it wasn't just Newton. Many of the big ideas or theories in science are the products of inductive thinking. Another example is Charles Darwin's inductive thinking about populations of organisms. And again, if we examine the processes, we can see inductive reasoning creeping through. Darwin made a number of discrete observations about how individuals in a population are adapted to their environments. If you're a biologist, you've probably looked at the beaks of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. You would know that the beaks have been modified or have been selected more appropriately for particular diets. And so we see a range of different sizes and shapes of beaks and sizes and shapes of finches that are often tied to the food availability on a particular island. Based on the observations that Darwin made, he came to two separate inferences. The first, that individuals with inherited traits that are more suited to the local environment are more likely to survive than those that are not. And this is a concept that we describe as fitness. And if you know much about Darwin's theory of natural selection, then you know that that's often referred to as survival of the fittest. The definition of fitness is what changes from population to population. Darwin's second inference, that survivors will pass on their traits to the next generation. This is known as reproductive success, and it's critically important to the process of natural selection because it's no good that you have sufficient qualities or traits or skills or character that enables you to preferentially survive while others die. You need to be able to pass those advantages onto your children and for those to continue through into the generations, preferably increasing in their frequency. That's reproductive success, and that's how populations change over time. After many such inferences, Darwin developed a new big idea which generalizes how populations change over time. Darwin didn't come up with the idea of evolution. It preceded him by hundreds of years. But what he did come up with was the theory of evolution by natural selection. Natural selection was his idea. You could argue it was also the idea of Alfred Wallace, who was working on similar sorts of things at a similar time frame and actually wrote to Darwin sharing some of his ideas. And it's probable that Wallace's ideas prompted Darwin to push forward and publish his own. So there's a very small number of steps associated with inductive reasoning. We come from the specific observation to a pattern recognition, and then we make a general conclusion. So to go back to an earlier point, I observe a white swan. I observe another white swan. In fact, I observe a number of white swans. What does this lead me to think? Well, I think I see a pattern emerging here, and that is that all swans are white. But of course, they're not. Scientific laws describe the relationship between the variables of a system. They're usually expressed in the form of mathematical equations. Scientific laws are examples of inductive reasoning. Induction is not without its critics. Sir Karl Popper, an Austrian-British philosopher, rejected inductivism, claiming that for induction to be true, every instance of its inference must be true. And that's what we've talked about with the swans. Since it's virtually impossible to claim that every inductivist inference will always be true, critics of inductivism have suggested that it's not a relevant reasoning tool in science. It's just simply not possible for you to observe every single instance of anything, highlighted by the example of the swans. Before Europeans arrived in Australia, it was thought that all swans were actually white. So that idea, based on observations, that generalization, held pretty true. But early European explorers to Western Australia spotted the first recorded sightings of black swans. A strict interpretation of inductive reasoning would imply that the inference was wrong. All swans are not white. However, rather than discarding the proposition altogether, a better approach would be to modify it to state most swans are white. Thus, the original proposition is still valid. It's not necessary for inductivist inferences to be true in all instances. It is, however, important that those inferences are true most of the time. Hence, if a theory explains most but not all observations, then that theory is scientifically valid. Observations that are not supported by those inferences may be exceptions or anomalies. Those of you who study chemistry know that we have lots of laws in chemistry where there are exceptions to the rules. But where do we draw the line? One of the problems with exceptions and modifying our ideas or our conclusions, our inferences, based on additional observations that we make that don't fit with our original idea, can end up leading to so many exceptions that the rule becomes nonsense. So where are we drawing the line? Although Newton's laws of motion are true, those laws cannot describe the motion of objects that move close to the speed of light. The physics of objects moving in those conditions are exceptions under Newton's laws of motion. However, Einstein's theory of special relativity provides explanations when Newton's laws cannot. So do we reject one in favour of the other? These two theories explain the motion of objects under different circumstances, and hence both are equally valid. In general, scientific theories and paradigms explain most observations, and a few discrepant observations will not invalidate those theories. One other small example of where the process of induction can break down is where we get false inferences. Sometimes a false inference can be derived even if all of the underlying propositions are true. One example of this comes from the medical field. Mutations of the BRCA gene are associated with breast cancer. A number of women in particular who have the BRCA gene mutation have developed breast cancer. So a conclusion could be that the BRCA gene mutation causes breast cancer. In fact, mutations of the BRCA genes are associated with breast cancer doesn't mean that those mutations cause it, or that breast cancer formation is a certainty in women with those genetic mutations. Studies have shown that many women with mutations in the BRCA genes don't develop breast cancer, or certainly didn't at the time of the study. So we need to be very careful with some of our generalizations. Well, that's a lot of time to talk about induction, so let's talk about deduction. And deductive reasoning is probably most closely associated with Sherlock Holmes, and Benedict Cumberbatch just gets his picture in here because he's my favourite Sherlock Holmes. Deduction is another form of scientific reasoning based on rationalism. It produces explanations by deriving specific conclusions from general laws, principles, or theories. Hopefully, what you're starting to do now is see that we've flipped the reasoning. Now we're going from the general laws to the specific applications. So here is a different way of looking at things. We went in induction from specific observations to general laws. Now in deduction, we're going from general laws or principles to specific cases where we can apply those theories or laws. The deductivist school of reasoning was firmly established by Sir Karl Popper, as you would probably expect, given he was such a critic of inductivism, and obviously popularised by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional character, Sherlock Holmes. In science, the deductive approach is more recent than the inductive approach. Deductive reasoning has produced a powerful method of scientific inquiry known as hypothesis testing. Deductive reasoning and hypothesis testing are commonly used in high school science experiments, and I'm sure you've done this plenty of times, including SRPs, which you did maybe in years 7, 8, or 9. It starts with a general theory, which is used to derive a hypothesis. The hypotheses are predictive statements that are tested in controlled experiments or other observations. They often are related in cause and effect type ways. The results of those investigations are used to either support or refute the scientific hypothesis. An example of deductive reasoning might be, if an angle measures between 90 and 180 degrees, then it's called an obtuse angle. This is a definition. If we observe an angle A to be 120 degrees, then we can deduce that A is an obtuse angle. Now that's just applying the general law to the specific case. A is 120 degrees, angles between 90 and 180 degrees are obtuse angles, therefore A is an obtuse angle. The process is a little more complex for deductive reasoning because there's a few steps associated with it. We have our existing theory, we formulate our hypotheses, we collect data and analyse that data, and then we accept or reject our hypothesis. Most of the time, we're going to not reject it. So we're not going to have sufficient evidence to reject our hypothesis, and therefore we'll accept it. A nice example of deductive reasoning comes from the history of atomic theory. The discovery of the electron by J.J. Thomson is a good example of deductive thinking. While studying the nature of cathode rays, Thomson was exploring the basis of atomic theory. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it was thought that atoms were electrically neutral and indivisible constituents of matter. This is based on John Dalton's work. However, through careful experimentation and data analysis, Thomson discovered that atoms were composed of subatomic particles. One type of subatomic particle was negatively charged and was called an electron. What J.J. Thomson showed was that cathode rays were negatively charged. He carried out experiments and worked out that the way that the cathode rays were behaving indicated that they were negatively charged. The negatively charged cathode rays were due to streams of negatively charged particles called electrons. Electrons are subatomic particles that are about 1/1800th times smaller than a hydrogen atom. You may not be aware that a hydrogen atom, the most common form of hydrogen atoms, are atoms that have just one proton in the nucleus, no neutrons, and one electron. So comparing an electron to a hydrogen atom is very similar to comparing it to a proton. So this started to also fill some gaps in for us as we go further into our study of atomic theory. So from the general concept and understanding of cathode rays, J.J. Thomson derived specific knowledge about electrons. As a result of his discoveries, the atomic theory was modified. You may know this from the plum pudding model, which was Thomson's model. He still held on to that idea that atoms were neutrally charged, but now he knew that there were electrons in there, tiny negatively charged particles. They were his plums in the pudding. The pudding itself was some positively charged mass that was countering the negatively charged electrons. Now, we subsequently know that this model of the atom is limited too. It's not correct. But it was a nice example of how going from general rules about atoms and general rules about cathode rays, we could look at some specific qualities and therefore make modifications in our understanding of how the world works. We could apply deductive reasoning to the cell theory as well. The key differences from the general to the specific rather than the specific to the general are the main difference between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So if we're doing deductive reasoning, then we would go from the general idea that life is built from cells. This is a component of the cell theory. That means that we predict, our hypothesis is that we expect to observe cells under the microscope. Then we put our samples under the microscope and observe them and find, yes, in fact, we actually do observe cells under the microscope. In applying deductive reasoning, we can look at two main methods, the modus ponens and the modus tollens. The modus you probably would be familiar with is modus operandi, or MO. This is method of operation, and it's often used in the solving of crime on the basis that people who commit crimes often do so in a fairly similar and predictable way. Modus ponens is Latin for method of affirming, and modus tollens for method of denying. But how do we apply these two in deductive reasoning? Modus ponens is a rule of inference which is used to draw logical conclusions on the basis that if P is true, and if P implies Q, then Q must also be true. Modus tollens, on the other hand, is a rule of inference drawn from both the combination of modus ponens, a positive statement or relationship, and a contrapositive. It states that if Q is false, and if P implies Q, then P is false. Modus tollens is the basis of falsifiability, a method of testing scientific hypotheses, and a very much an idea developed by Karl Popper. Modus tollens begins with an accepted premise or a theory which is often stated as a predictive statement, if, then. It then attempts to make an inference with a negative observation. You've probably heard the phrase, there's no smoke without fire. If we turn that into a modus tollens statement, then our premise would be, if there's no smoke, there is no fire. So therefore, if we make an observation that there is no smoke, then the logical inference based on the modus tollens principle is a negative or false statement linked to an implication, there's no fire. If there's no smoke, and where there's no smoke, there's no fire, then there can be no fire. Such reasoning was the basis of falsifiability and the use of what we call null hypotheses in hypothesis testing. Now, a null hypothesis is basically a way of stating a problem in a way that suggests that there is no effect, there's no impact. When we use the null hypothesis, we develop a null hypothesis from a scientific hypothesis, because the scientific hypothesis is almost always stated in the positive way. That is, the taking of a particular drug will assist patients who suffer from X disease. So that's scientific. What we want to do is see if this drug is going to have a positive impact on patients. So therefore, the null hypothesis is derived from that particular statement to say, well, it doesn't have an effect. And let's see what we can test. After testing the null hypothesis using statistical tools, which we'll again look at in Module 3 of this course, we can reject the null hypothesis results in the acceptance of the scientific hypothesis. Now, the reverse is also true. We could accept the null hypothesis and reject the scientific hypothesis and actually suggest that there is no impact. This particular drug has no effect on patients with a particular disease. That's still scientific in one sense because we've actually shown something not to be the case, but it's a null hypothesis because our hypothesis is based on the fact that there's no impact from this particular intervention. For deductivist conclusions to be correct, the theories on which they are based must also be true, and this is not always the case. The theories on which deductive hypotheses are based are often the products of inductive reasoning. This relationship can result in circular arguments which can't be proven or in false conclusions. One example that illustrates this is the link between autism and vaccination, and I've provided just a little screenshot there, and there's a link in the note. Historically, some vaccines contained a mercury-based preservative called thimerosal. Mercury poisoning is associated with symptoms that are similar to autism spectrum disorder. What do we conclude? Vaccines cause autism. Numerous scientific tests have shown that thimerosal is a safe preservative. Despite this, amid public speculation, thimerosal is no longer used as a preservative in vaccines. There are many different mercury compounds and they vary widely in their toxicity. Methyl mercury, an environmental organocompound, is very toxic to humans, while some other forms of mercury are well tolerated by humans. However, the public assumes that mercury is a single substance that only exists in one form. Thus, although the deductive conclusion described above is correct, the incorrect assumptions make the conclusion invalid. To avoid such erroneous conclusions, Popper suggested that deductive reasoning should be based on the principle of falsifiability. Falsifiability has become the standard method of hypothesis testing, and we shall examine this concept later in this module. So then, what is the role of inductivism and deductivism in modern science? In simple terms, inductive reasoning produces general principles that are used to construct theories of natural phenomena, while deductive reasoning provides avenues for verification of theories, mainly through hypothesis testing. So both induction and deduction are complementary reasoning tools used in modern science. Inductive reasoning produces general principles that are used to construct theories of natural phenomena. Deductive reasoning provides avenues for verification of theories, mainly through hypothesis testing. An example from the biological field, genome sequencing projects use inductive reasoning to identify and characterize genetic elements in the genomes of various organisms. This information can then be extrapolated to identify some genomic features that are common to the species, genus, even phylum that the organism belongs to. These are big-scale generalizations. But deductive reasoning can be used to determine the functions of gene families and perhaps be used in genetic manipulation experiments. Apart from induction and deduction, there are other modes of reasoning and logic. Ultimately, the type of reasoning used in science investigations is not as important as how observations are analysed to develop conclusions. Thanks for watching.